In the fall of 1867, along a lonely stretch of road between Joplin and Springfield, Missouri, federal investigators stumbled upon a discovery that would haunt the Ozarks for decades. Beneath the creaking floorboards of Sullivan's trading post, they uncovered ledgers listing the names, descriptions, and estimated fortunes of more than 300 travelers. Next to each name, written in precise Irish script, were notations that froze even seasoned lawmen. Routes taken, trails chosen, expected return listed as none, and amounts of gold recovered. The final entry, written just 2 weeks before the discovery, recorded a German prospector named H. Zimmerman traveling alone with an estimated $8,000 in gold dust. That note carried a sense of urgency and fear. Patrick Sullivan was overheard saying, "We finish this one, then leave Missouri for good." What those records revealed was not a simple case of highway robbery, but the outline of one of the most organized murder conspiracies of post-Civil War America, one that reached deep into the power structure of southwest Missouri. But to understand Patrick and Shaw Sullivan, you have to begin with the land that allowed their crimes to take root. The Ozark Mountains, in the years after the war, were wild, untamed, and hostile to outside authority. Federal law carried little weight, and local justice was often decided by whoever carried the biggest gun. By 1867, the region was scarred by the lingering aftermath of the war. Former Confederate guerrillas prowled the hills as bandits, while Union veterans, many of them Irish immigrants who had fought for land and opportunity, struggled to survive in a community that treated them with suspicion. Into this unstable frontier came Patrick and Shaw Sullivan, two brothers from County Cork who had served in the 9th Missouri Infantry. Patrick, at 32, was sharp-witted and silver-tongued, able to win a stranger's trust in minutes. His younger brother Shaw, built like a fighter at 28, had learned that violence, when used decisively, solved what persuasion could not. In the spring of 1864, they opened their trading post at Hellhound Crossing, where the main road from Joplin to Springfield met Devil's Backbone Trail, a shorter but treacherous path through the Ozarks. The post was nothing fancy, just a log building with shelves of supplies and tables for weary travelers. What made it different was how the brothers worked their guests. Patrick charmed travelers with easy talk and insider knowledge, while Shaw's intimidating presence kept doubts or suspicions firmly in check. At the time, Missouri's backroads were alive with prospectors returning east from the waning California gold rush. They were men carrying the results of years of grueling work dust nuggets and hard-earned cash. These men were tough, suspicious, and dangerous when threatened, but they were also isolated and far from protection. While most merchants dreaded their business, the Sullivan brothers thrived. They seemed to know exactly how to handle even the hardest customer. And in doing so, they built a trap at the crossroads of the Ozarks that would swallow hundreds whole. Prospectors who reached Hellhound Crossing often arrived suspicious and on edge, yet somehow left hours later laughing, shaking hands with the Sullivan brothers, and carrying carefully drawn maps that promised safe passage. What no one realized was that the Sullivans hadn't spent their first year in Missouri building a business. They'd built a network of information bribes and quiet threats that turned their modest trading post into the center of the most profitable criminal enterprise the Ozarks had ever seen. The first hint that something sinister was happening came in October 1864, when Martha Hensley, the wife of a farmer, carried a basket of eggs to the post just after sunset. As she reached the back door, she froze at the sound of voices seeping through the log walls. Patrick's lilting Irish brogue was unmistakable, but the other voice was a stranger speaking, with an edge of worry. The German Klaus he left 3 days ago with enough gold to buy half of Springfield. Took Devil's Backbone, like you said. Should have made the main road by now, but no one's seen him. Patrick's calm reply made Martha's blood run cold. That trail's dangerous, especially for a man traveling alone. Anything could happen. Animals, bandits, accidents. Who's to say? The stranger pressed his tone uneasy, but Shaw's deep voice cut him off with a threat sharp enough to silence any doubts. You questioning us? Maybe you'd rather take this up with Sheriff Dalton. The conversation ended there, but the meaning was clear. Martha backed away, abandoning her eggs and fleeing into the night, shaken but unsure who she could trust. Sheriff Dalton drank with Patrick, and federal marshals were rare in those hills. What had she really heard? Nothing more than dark suspicion, she told herself. A silence she would regret forever, because within 2 weeks, 3 more prospectors vanished along Devil's Backbone Trail. By December, the disappearances were impossible to ignore. Frederick Steinbeck, a Springfield innkeeper, began asking questions when his brother-in-law Klaus failed to arrive for Christmas. Letters from California confirmed Klaus had planned to take the Missouri route in November. Frederick traced him to Sullivan's trading post, where Patrick greeted him with sympathy and produced a hand-marked map of the exact trail he'd recommended. Dangerous country, Patrick said gravely. We warned him not to travel alone, but he was set on reaching Springfield fast. Shaw nodded with solemn agreement. Their story sounded reasonable, their concern genuine, and Frederick found no cracks, no matter how many times he returned. But unease gnawed at him, as if the truth was just out of reach. By spring of 1865, it was no longer just whispered rumors. Entire communities along the roads between Joplin and Springfield were seeing the same pattern. Travelers disappeared, and the trail of questions always seemed to circle back to the crossroads where the Sullivan brothers reigned. The response from local law enforcement was more dismissive than decisive. Sheriff Thomas Dalton, a former Confederate cavalry officer turned peacekeeper, publicly brushed off the disappearances as nothing more than the chaos left in the war's wake. He told worried citizens that the hills were crawling with Confederate stragglers, Union deserters, and ruthless bandits, and that any man carrying a fortune in gold was tempting fate. To travel alone, Dalton said, was to gamble with one's life. Yet in private, Dalton was far less certain. His doubts didn't center on the Sullivan brothers. If anything, he trusted them more than anyone else. Patrick Sullivan, in particular, had become one of his most valuable informants. Somehow Patrick always seemed to know where trouble was brewing. Time and again, his tips had led Dalton to real criminals, stolen goods, and fugitives hiding in the woods. In just 2 years, the Sullivans had helped the sheriff lock up more outlaws than he had managed in his entire career. They'd given testimony, exposed smuggling operations, and even pointed out stolen livestock. To Dalton, the brothers weren't suspects, they were partners in restoring order. That trust hardened into protection. When Frederick Steinbeck refused to stop pressing for answers about his missing brother-in-law, Dalton finally snapped, telling him flat out to quit hounding honest businessmen with reckless accusations. In a tense meeting in March 1865, Dalton reminded Frederick that the Sullivans had done more for law and order than anyone else in the county. They'd risked their lives to help, he said, and asked for nothing but the freedom to run their legitimate business. If Frederick couldn't accept that, then he'd better stop stirring up trouble. It was clear the law would not be on Frederick's side. But he wasn't alone. Across the Ozarks, families of missing men were starting to trade stories, their suspicions growing louder as the disappearances mounted. Meanwhile, the Sullivans' empire was spreading quietly and effectively. The trading post was no longer just a roadside stop. It had become the hub of a far-reaching network that stretched from Kansas to Arkansas. Every traveler who passed through unknowingly fed the brothers' ledger of intelligence where they had come from, where they were bound, how much money they carried, whether they had companions or traveled alone. What Patrick recorded in his hidden notebooks went far beyond names and destinations. Each entry contained a sharp psychological sketch, whether a man was cautious or reckless, patient or desperate, strong or sickly. Patrick had turned victim selection into a science. The most desirable targets were easy to spot: men fresh from the California goldfields, pockets-heavy families waiting far away, disappearances unlikely to be investigated swiftly. But the brilliance of the operation wasn't just in choosing victims. It was in the vast hidden web that supported the killings. Bandits executed the robberies, but merchants helped launder the gold. Corrupt officials deflected suspicion, and even preachers vouched for the Sullivans' Christian virtue. It was less a gang than a shadow government feeding off the lawlessness of the Ozarks, all built around a trading post that looked harmless to anyone passing through. By the spring of 1866, the Sullivan operation had grown so vast and effective that it was quietly fueling the economy of several Ozark towns. Gold that had been stolen from murdered travelers was laundered into legitimate currency, and that money paid for new businesses, church buildings, and even the region's first real school. The irony was cruel. The blood of missing men built prosperity that made the Sullivans appear indispensable pillars of the community. They gave generously to public causes, hired local men as laborers and guides, and treated their neighbors with nothing but kindness. To the people of the Ozarks, Patrick and Shaw Sullivan seemed like model citizens. But behind the facade, the killings continued, plotted with military precision and executed without flaw. The chain of events that would eventually bring down their empire didn't start with lawmen, but with a determined mother. Elenina McGreedy, widow of a Union officer killed at Shiloh, had raised her only son Thomas alone on a small Illinois farm. Against her wishes, Thomas joined the California gold rush, promising to return in 2 years with enough wealth to buy the neighboring farm and begin his own family. In March 1866, he sent her a letter from San Francisco, saying he had succeeded modestly, carrying about $3,000 in gold dust and nuggets enough to fulfill his dream. He wrote of excitement, hope, and gratitude, assuring his mother he would be home by May. When May passed with no sign of him, Elenina told herself it was a delay. By July, her worry hardened into dread. By August, she resolved to act. Unlike other grieving families who appealed emotionally to authorities, Elenina had discipline and training from the war years. She had worked with casualty records and missing soldier reports, learning how Union officers gathered and analyzed information. She approached her son's disappearance with the same methodical determination. Arriving in Springfield that August, she carried maps, notes, and a precise plan. She retraced her son's intended route, showing his photograph and description at every establishment. She carefully wrote down everything she was told, cross-checking stories and looking for patterns. Soon one became obvious. Multiple people remembered Thomas clearly, polite, thoughtful, and prompt with payment. The last reliable sighting came at Sullivan's trading post on April 15, 1866. After that, nothing. By the time she stepped onto the dusty porch of the trading post in September, Elenina already knew in her heart this was where her son's trail ended. She expected evasion. What she found instead was careful preparation. Patrick greeted her with warmth, offered sympathy, and immediately produced detailed records of her son's visit. According to him, Thomas had arrived on April 15th, bought supplies, and spent hours discussing travel options. Patrick claimed he'd strongly urged Thomas to take the longer, safer road to Springfield, warning him against the dangerous back trails. Shaw backed him up solemnly, producing a map with the main route clearly marked. They even provided the names of supposed witnesses who could confirm their version of events. Elenina left the post unsettled, but impressed by their attention to detail and apparent concern. It was only halfway back to Springfield, her mind replaying every word, that she realized what had unsettled her. For all their records and sympathy, the Sullivan brothers had been almost too ready, as though they had been expecting her arrival all along. Patrick Sullivan had revealed details about Thomas McGreedy's life that no stranger should have known. He spoke of Thomas as an only child of his plans to buy the neighboring farm, and of the exact sum of $3,000 he carried. These were facts Thomas had promised only to his mother, and that Elena herself had told no one during her search. That night in her room at Springfield's Palmer House, she realized the truth. The brothers' knowledge could only have come from Thomas himself, and if they knew, they were directly tied to his disappearance. Rather than retreat home with unanswered questions, she resolved to stay in Missouri and conduct the kind of investigation local authorities would not. Elena rented a modest house on Springfield's edge and transformed it into the headquarters of her one-woman intelligence effort. Drawing on her wartime experience, she began assembling files on every missing traveler she could trace, mapping routes, recording testimonies, and cross-referencing details with precision. Unlike others who had appealed emotionally and been dismissed, she approached the case with cold discipline, documenting inconsistencies and recognizing when men shaded the truth. Her persistence paid off. By December 1866, she had identified 47 cases with one common thread. Each man had traveled alone, carried money, and vanished soon after leaving Sullivan's trading post. Her breakthrough came in January 1867 when she met Mary Catherine O'Brien at a church social. Mary Catherine, a seamstress in Joplin, had grown up in the same part of County Cork as the Sullivan brothers. When Elena casually mentioned her interest in their background, Mary Catherine's face paled. She pulled her aside, whispering, "Those men are not who they say they are." She explained that in Ireland, they had been known as Patrick and Seamus O'Malley fugitives, wanted for a string of roadside robberies and murders. Her uncle, a constable at the time, had told her how the O'Malley brothers ran a network of thieves who targeted farmers traveling to market. Even when victims offered no resistance, they were often found dead. When the law began to close in, the brothers vanished, almost certainly boarding a ship for America under false names. This revelation changed everything. The Sullivan brothers were not men who had fallen into violence by circumstance. They were seasoned predators who had crossed the ocean to perfect their trade on new soil. Their Missouri enterprise was not invention, but evolution. Yet the information came at a cost. Within 2 weeks of confiding in Elena, Mary Catherine O'Brien disappeared. Her landlady reported she had left her boarding house in the middle of the night with only a small bag. No trace of her was ever found. Mary Catherine O'Brien's disappearance was no accident, and Elena McGreedy knew it. The seamstress had confided dangerous truths, and within days, she had vanished without a trace. The Irish community whispered, but no one admitted to knowing where she had gone. Elena recognized the truth immediately. The Sullivan brothers had silenced her just as they had silenced so many others. Worse, it meant her own inquiries were no longer secret. Her life was now in danger. Yet instead of retreating, she doubled down. If local authorities could not or would not stand against the Sullivans, she would build a case so thorough and undeniable that it would force action from higher powers. She realized the key was not only the missing men, but the missing money. Every victim had carried gold or cash. That wealth could not simply disappear. It had to be converted, exchanged, and circulated. The trail of blood was also a trail of gold. Elena began haunting Springfield's financial district, presenting herself as a curious widow, managing her own affairs. At banks' currency houses and gold exchanges, she asked careful questions, made small transactions, and listened. The picture that emerged pointed to Cornelius McBride, owner of the city's largest currency exchange. McBride had been converting suspiciously large amounts of gold into paper money, often at times that matched the disappearances along Devil's Backbone. His supposed explanation that the gold came from small local mining ventures collapsed under scrutiny. The deeper she dug, the darker the pattern became. McBride was not acting alone. His exchange was just one cog in a machine that included prominent Springfield businessmen, bankers, and even elected officials. Together, they formed a laundering network that transformed stolen gold into legitimate wealth, which then circulated back into the community as loans, investments, and donations. It explained why the killings had been ignored. The prosperity they produced enriched not only the Sullivans, but some of the most powerful men in southwest Missouri. By February 1867, Elena had assembled a staggering file: financial ledgers, sworn testimonies, maps showing clusters of disappearances, and even physical items collected from the routes where travelers had last been seen. It was more than proof of murder, it was a blueprint of systemic corruption. But she also understood the danger of misplacing her evidence. Local officials were compromised, and anyone she approached risked betraying her. Her solution was bold. She wrote to Captain James Hartford, a federal marshal in St. Louis, and a man she knew from her late husband's regiment. Hartford had a reputation for being incorruptible, and his authority extended across state lines, giving him jurisdiction over crimes involving interstate travelers. Elena's letter, sent in March 1867, was meticulous. She avoided accusations and instead laid out her findings like a report, letting Hartford draw his own conclusions. She enclosed copies of records, transcriptions of testimonies, and maps marking where the missing men had last been seen. Hartford's reply came swiftly. He would come to Missouri himself to investigate, and he urged Elena to take every precaution until he arrived. From her letter alone, he recognized the scale of what she had uncovered. This was not random banditry, but a criminal conspiracy intertwined with political and economic power. But what Elena could not have known was that the Sullivan brothers' network reached further than she imagined. They had cultivated friends not only among local merchants and officials, but among certain lawmen as well. Word of Hartford's impending investigation reached them within days, and by the time he set out for Missouri, the Sullivans and their allies were already preparing to strike back. Captain James Hartford entered Springfield on March 15, 1867, under an assumed name, careful not to carry too many official documents that might alert local allies of the Sullivan brothers. He met Elena McGreedy in the quiet basement of a Lutheran church whose pastor discreetly offered sanctuary for their secret discussions. For 3 hours, Hartford listened as the widow laid out her files, maps and records, each piece fitting neatly into a picture of a criminal empire unlike anything he had ever seen. By the end, even the hardened federal marshal was shaken. Mrs. McGreedy, Hartford said, studying her charts, "What you've uncovered isn't just a string of murders. This is organized crime, a shadow economy built on stolen gold and blood. These men have turned killing into a business." He knew they could not wait. The Sullivan brothers had contacts in law enforcement and politics. Word of his presence in Missouri might already be spreading. If they hesitated, the entire operation would close ranks before he could act. The only way forward was speed and precision. Hartford decided to strike everywhere at once, raiding the core of the network before it had time to defend itself. At dawn on March 18, 1867, federal agents moved in. They hit Sullivan's trading post, Cornelius McBride's exchange, and the homes of half a dozen conspirators simultaneously. What they found would horrify even the most battle-hardened investigators. Beneath the false floorboards of the trading post lay the records Eleanor had always suspected, ledgers documenting hundreds of vanished travelers, but also something worse, caches of personal belongings stripped from the dead. Watches, wedding bands, lockets, and letters from men who had been on their way home to families who never saw them again. Most chilling of all were Patrick Sullivan's notebooks. Page after page described victims in cold, clinical detail. Psychological sketches, estimates of wealth, calculations of risk, and instructions for how to funnel men toward ambush sites. An entry dated January 1866 spelled out the fate of Thomas McGreedy Young, Irish-American, recently from California, carrying approx. $3,000. Traveling alone to Illinois. Mother, a widow. No other relatives likely to press inquiry. Recommend Devil's Backbone route. Camping at Widow's Creek. Notified Hartley crew to expect him March 20th. The ledgers also exposed the rot at the heart of the region's power. Patrick had kept financial accounts of how each murder's profits were divided. Sheriff Thomas Dalton received a $200 cut for every victim. Cornelius McBride took a steady 15% commission for laundering the gold, and even Springfield's mayor Robert Crenshaw drew monthly stipends larger than his official pay. The raid on McBride's office revealed the laundering machine in full. Stolen gold had been converted into paper currency, then funneled into respectable businesses that not only hid its bloody origins, but also made the conspirators wealthier still. Other teams combed the countryside. At Widow's Creek, the place Thomas McGreedy had been steered, they unearthed shallow graves, fragments of clothing, and bones that bore unmistakable signs of violent ends. But the greatest betrayal was exposed in Sheriff Dalton's own office safe. Inside lay a file of correspondence with Patrick Sullivan, dating back 3 years, not just evidence of bribery, but of direct involvement. Dalton hadn't turned a blind eye, he had been part of the planning. One letter from Sullivan, written in September 1866, referenced Elelanina herself. The McGreedy woman keeps asking questions. Her boy was one of our most profitable cases. Perhaps it's time she joined him on the backbone. Persistent types rarely quit, and she's becoming a real danger to us. Dalton's chilling reply read, "Agreed about the McGreedy problem, but killing a woman will draw federal heat. Must be handled carefully. Better to stage an accident when she returned to Illinois. Make it look like bandits on the road. I can provide her travel plans." That was Sheriff Dalton's chilling suggestion in his letters to Patrick Sullivan. The correspondence revealed that Elelanina McGreedy had unknowingly been living under a death sentence for months, spared only because she stayed in Missouri, rather than returning home where the conspirators expected to ambush her. When the raids and arrests became public, the true reach of the Sullivan network shook the Ozarks. It wasn't just the brothers Dalton and McBride. Dozens of respected townsfolk had profited in some way. Merchants who moved stolen goods, bankers who handled dirty loans, and officials who pocketed bribes to steer investigations away from the truth. The collapse hit Springfield's economy hard. Businesses tied to the blood money folded. McBride's exchange shut down, leaving ordinary citizens scrambling to recover savings. Even the First Methodist Church faced scandal when its building fund was exposed as seeded with laundered gold. Patrick Sullivan, cornered by the evidence, and knowing the gallows awaited him, confessed in full detail. Between April 1864 and March 1867, their network murdered 127 people, stealing more than $400,000 in gold and cash. A staggering fortune for the era. He boasted to investigators, "We weren't bandits. Bandits are reckless and foolish. We were businessmen. Information was our greatest weapon. With planning, risks vanish and profits grow." Shaw Sullivan's statements were colder still. He described killings as though recounting battle maneuvers, efficient strike-staged scenes to mimic accidents or raids, and bodies hidden to erase all trace. But their testimony revealed something even darker. The Sullivans were not an isolated horror. They had communicated with other groups in neighboring states, sharing techniques and sometimes coordinating. The murder-for-profit system was spreading into a multi-state criminal industry. the first outlines of organized crime in America's heartland. The trials opened in St. Louis in October 1867 and drew national attention. Newspapers dubbed the case the Missouri Murder Machine. Jurors heard Elelenena's files presented alongside federal evidence ledgers of victims' maps of ambush routes, the gruesome artifacts recovered from shallow graves. The weight of proof was overwhelming. Patrick and Shaw Sullivan were convicted of 127 murders and hanged on February 14, 1868. More than 3,000 people gathered to witness their execution, many of them families who had traveled for years searching for answers about missing loved ones. Patrick reportedly told the prison chaplain, "We gave those men quick deaths, more mercy than the world usually grants." Sheriff Dalton and a dozen others received life sentences. McBride and several more drew 20-year terms. The trials tore back the curtain on a criminal enterprise so disciplined and organized, it seemed more like a government than a gang. For the first time, Americans saw how corruption, greed, and murder could weave into a shadow economy that thrived in plain sight. Elelena McGreedy emerged from the ordeal a hero. Newspapers praised her as the woman whose courage had toppled a murderous empire. Federal officials offered her a role in the new investigative division that would later become the FBI. She refused, returning instead to her Illinois farm. She had found justice, but not peace. The truth had been exposed, but it could not give her back her son. Thomas McGreedy had died young alone on a desolate trail, his dreams of family and farm destroyed by men who reduced him to a ledger entry. Patrick Sullivan's final confession contained details so graphic about Thomas McGreedy's last hours that they haunted Elelena for the rest of her life. Yet the Sullivan case did more than expose one murderous network. It forced the nation to confront the vulnerability of its roads and communities in the years after the Civil War. In response, the federal government introduced regular patrol routes along major travel corridors and established communication lines that allowed lawmen in different states to coordinate more effectively. It was the first step toward what would eventually become national policing standards. But the most unsettling lesson of the Sullivan conspiracy was not about roads or patrols. It was about trust. For 3 years, the brothers thrived not because of fear, but because of the mask of respectability they wore. They donated to churches, supported schools, and treated neighbors with kindness. By the time their victims realized they were being led into a trap, it was too late. They weaponized the very human instinct to trust those who seemed generous and familiar. Hellhound Crossing, where the trading post once stood, was burned to ash by federal agents after the trials. Still, for decades, travelers avoided the site. Local accounts spoke of unease, an oppressive weight that clung to the crossroads. Whether that feeling was supernatural or simply the echo of remembered horror, no one could say. Federal authorities sealed the case files, and many historians believe the reason wasn't superstition at all, but the disturbing evidence that similar operations were active in other states. That fear was partly confirmed in 1902, when railroad workers carving a line through the Ozarks unearthed a mass grave along Devil's Backbone Trail. The remains of 47 people lay jumbled together, their personal effects matching descriptions from the Sullivan files. It proved that even Patrick's meticulous confessions had not revealed the full scope of their crimes. The discovery raised questions that could never be answered. Had the brothers been killing longer than anyone realized? Were there other graves hidden in the wilderness? And most haunting, had members of their network escaped justice and carried their methods elsewhere? Elelena McGreedy passed away in 1894, never fully at peace. Her personal papers, donated to the Illinois Historical Society, revealed that she had never stopped searching. Until the end, she investigated disappearances in other states: Colorado, Nebraska, Texas, suspecting that the Sullivan conspiracy was only one piece of a larger frontier-wide enterprise. Among her notes was a letter she never finished a draft warning federal officials that she had identified patterns strikingly similar to Missouri. The final mystery lies in what remains hidden. Official records cite 127 victims, but Patrick hinted at special arrangements for high-value targets, arrangements he never explained. Historians have speculated that these could include the unsolved disappearances of a California legislator en route to Washington, a wealthy mine owner lost between Missouri and Illinois, and even several federal officials whose deaths were attributed to accidents or illness. The site of Hellhound Crossing was rebuilt as a trading post in 1889, but the business collapsed. Within 2 years, travelers simply refused to stop. The intersection was later bypassed, swallowed by forest. Today, it exists only as a place reached by foot, where moss-covered trails wind through the hills and silence lingers heavy. Among locals, the Sullivan brothers have become figures of folklore, their story told in whispers. Some say the cries of their victims still echo through the trees, warning travelers to turn back. Others claim that if you linger too long on Devil's Backbone after dark, you might glimpse the shadow of 2 Irish brothers still waiting at the crossroads with a smile, a map, and a promise of safe passage that never comes. Some say descendants of those who once profited from the Sullivan conspiracy still live in the Ozarks, bound by the same unspoken silence that shielded the brothers for years. But the true terror of this case isn't found in whispers of surviving kin or ghost stories about Devil's Backbone. It's in how ordinary the scheme really was. The Sullivans did not rely on magic madness or genius. They watched, listened, and planned. They preyed on human trust, turning kindness and hospitality into weapons. They built a network of bribes and favors that made their murders nearly invisible. And for 3 long years, it worked. That is the legacy of Hellhound Crossing. It reminds us that evil doesn't always wear the face of an outlaw or a monster. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor offering a drink, a map, and a friendly warning. The federal government's response patrol routes, missing persons databases, interstate coordination can all be traced back to lessons learned in blood from the Sullivan case. But the larger questions remain unanswered. How many other networks thrived in the chaos of post-Civil War America? How many missing travelers were quietly erased by organized conspiracies? Not chance encounters with outlaws, and how many similar systems of corruption built on silence and respectability still exist today in places we least expect? The Sullivan brothers' story is more than a historical crime. It is a warning. They succeeded not because they were brilliant killers, but because they understood something about human nature that most people want to believe the best of their neighbors. They twisted that trust into a trap, and by the time their victims realized the truth, it was too late. So, what do you think? Was the full truth of the Sullivan conspiracy ever revealed? Or do the sealed federal case files still hide connections too dangerous to expose? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your theories. If this tale unsettled you and you want more stories from the darker corners of American history, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves true crime and haunted history. The past is never as far away as we think. And sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we should fear. Until next time, remember, evil often hides in plain sight.